If you've set up a project and added a drawing scale to your drawings, you're ready for takeoff. This lesson, using count traces, gets you started. After viewing this lesson, you'll know how to take a measurement using a count trace. In Dimension, traces are what you use to measure or take off elements from your two-dimensional plans. I'm looking at the landscape plan, which shows the trees and shrubs to be counted. I'm going to use the zoom rectangle to zoom into the plan so we can get started. Next, I'll add the Trace List tree control to the control panel. This control shows all of the standard traces I have set up. Now, your list might look different from this. If someone in your organization has already created a trace library, you'll see those instead. When you complete takeoff measurements on an estimate, you'll typically use the specific traces from your list. Now, you'll probably also see these 4 generic trace types: count, length, area, and perimeter. Since we're just getting started, we'll use these generic trace types so you see how each one works. Notice that these 4 match the buttons here on the Home tab. Think of these as the clap quantities: count, length, area, and perimeter. We'll come back to them throughout these lessons. You can initiate a trace of one of these 4 types either by double-clicking the trace in the list or clicking a button in the toolbar. You see slightly different functionality depending on which method you use, and I'll explain both of those methods in this lesson. The simplest of the clap traces is the count trace. Count traces are used to count the number of a certain type of object or component based on mouse clicks. This landscaped island will have different types of trees and shrubs, and I need to count the number of each type. I'll start with the sunburst honey locusts. Now, before I start, notice that my cursor is a white arrow with a second blue arrow next to it. This tells me I'm in select mode, which is the default mode when no trace or other action is in progress. To start the trace, I'll double-click the count trace in my list. And now notice that my cursor has changed to an arrow with a ruler next to it. This is how the cursor appears whenever I'm taking a measurement. To count the trees, I'll simply click each one. As soon as I click the first tree, my cursor changes again, indicating that I'm in the middle of taking a measurement. As I continue clicking trees, notice that the quantity list control shows me the count total as I click. To finish a trace, I'll double-click the last point. Now, notice several things at this point. My cursor has gone back to the blue arrow because I've completed this trace and I'm now in select mode again. The landscape plan in the drawing list appears in bold, which indicates that there are takeoff measurements associated with this sheet. The points in the measurement have a yellow rim around them, telling me that the measurement is still selected. The quantity list shows values for the measurement that is currently selected or in progress. The measurement summary shows a list of all traces on the sheet that have been completed. Right now, there's only one. Remember that Dimension has tons of information in the tooltips. When I hold my mouse over the Count button, I see the list of keyboard shortcuts I can use. Let's actually take a screenshot of these tips so we can refer to them. Now, there are several types of trees and shrubs here, and I need to be able to differentiate them. The tooltip shows me that I can press the D key to assign a description. So I'll press D and type a description. The measurement summary now shows the new description. That becomes very helpful when I have multiple count measurements. You can use the description to differentiate traces using whatever convention you want. I use the type of tree here, but the description could include the location, the phase code, whatever works for you. If you don't change the description, it will retain the name of the standard trace, and that might be sufficient for what you need. Next, I want to count the dense yew shrubs. The tooltip tells me that I can press N to start a new measurement. So I'll press N and again the cursor changes to the arrow with the yellow ruler. Now last time I finished the measurement by double-clicking the last point. Checking the tooltip again, I see that I can also finish by pressing S. Uh-oh, it looks like I missed a dense U in my count. I'll quickly add a description to the measurement and then I'll fix that. So how do I go back in and add the point I missed? Over here on the right, my toolbar extends past the edge of the window. But here's the rest of it. The Add Points button is the one I'm looking for. It lets me add points to the selected measurement, and I can start by pressing A. This lets me continue adding points as if I hadn't closed the measurement. Notice that my cursor has yet another new look. The plus sign tells me I'm in Add mode. I'll grab that last shrub and press S to finish. I initiated both of my traces so far by double-clicking the Count trace in the Trace control. That means they both use the red circles as their points, which will make it harder to tell them apart. Different traces can have different colors and point styles assigned to them. So now let's look at that. Next, I need to count the number of dwarf burning bushes. When I click the Count button in the toolbar, the Easy Trace Creation window opens. This actually lets me create a new standard trace, which will be added to my trace list. I'm going to give this trace its name right off the bat, the Dwarf Burning Bush trace. It's nice to have visual indicators for each trace so I can easily tell them apart. I'll select a different shape and color for this one. When I click OK, notice that the trace is added as a new trace in my list, so I can reuse it as often as I need to on any drawing or project, not just this one. As I complete the trace, notice that the green triangles give a nice contrast with the red circles. The trace appears with the name I just assigned it, both in the quantity list as well as the measurement list. Oops, I made another mistake. I added an extra point. Since the trace is still in progress, I can use the Undo button on the right of my toolbar. I could also use Ctrl-Z to undo that last point. Now, in later lessons, we'll talk a lot more about configuring standard traces, especially if you plan to use eTakeoff Bridge to send takeoff quantities to Sage Estimating in alignment with your Sage Estimating standard database. You have lots of options for differentiating measurements on the plans, and you've seen a couple of them here. Assigning different descriptions to traces, creating different standard traces to use for different objects, and changing the colors and point styles. Your process will depend on your organization's unique needs, and you'll want to work with any other estimators on your team to develop these conventions. For now, we're just getting started, and you've seen how easily you can start performing measurements with count traces. This lesson gave you an introduction to traces and showed you how to work with a count trace. Using traces is an important foundational skill for getting really good with dimension. Before you move on to the next lesson, take some time to complete the activity in the handout. Thanks for viewing this Anytime Learning video.